wind that scoured the top of the skyscraper had a chemical bite to it, a smell of ozone and exhaust that was nothing like the clean, cold air he remembered. Down below the city was a fantastic circuit board of light, a relentless 24-hour hum of human ambition. He stood on the graveled roof, a man carved from driftwood and left in the sun too long. His suit, a dark wool thing he'd bought decades ago, flapped around a frame that was all bone and wire. He was old. His hair was the color of old snow, and his face was a road map of sorrows. But his eyes were another matter. They were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, and in them 1,000 years of watching and waiting had not dimmed the light. This island, this whole continent had once been his. Not in the way these people owned things, with paper deeds and property taxes, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. He remembered the forest that had stood right here, a tangled cathedral of oak and pine so dense the sunlight came down in hazy, shifting columns. He remembered the feel of soft earth under his bare feet, the smell of damp leaves and rich soil. He remembered the men who had come, their faces painted with ochre and awe, their hands empty of weapons. They came to the foot of his great rock, their shaman chanting words of respect. That was the night of the covenant. It was not a treaty, but an understanding. His kind, the elder race, were the regulators, the gardeners of the wild. They kept the balance. They hunted the things that stalked the edges of the firelight, the creatures that sanity and folklore had wisely chosen to forget. They culled the herds, kept the rivers clean, and in return, the race of man was to honor the wild, to take only what they needed, to remember that the world was not theirs to pave over. He looked down at the river of yellow taxis, the canyons of steel and glass. They had not forgotten the covenant. They had outgrown it. They had rewritten the terms of existence with electricity and combustion, and in their new world, there was no room for balance. There was only progress. A roaring, devouring beast that ate forests and spat out suburbs. The old gods were dead, and the new ones were named after the great stock exchanges. A tremor ran through him, a jolt that had nothing to do with the city's vibration. It was a dissonant chord in the silent music of his blood, a distant scream across a network woven from instinct and his very biological makeup. Far away, the Carpathians. One of the sleepers had been stirred. A recent earthquake, a minor thing by the standards of the New World's rumbling industries, had cracked open a deep place. The one who woke was not waking gently into a new spring. He was being born into a world he did not know, a world of noise and stench and fear. The king felt the sleeper's confusion curdle into mindless rage, a pure, instinctual terror that lashed out at everything. It was a pain in his own soul, a phantom limb aching with a brother's agony. His work, his grim, necessary work. The king turned from the edge, his joints protesting with a dry creak. He descended through the building, an unseen presence in the service elevator, and walked out into the indifferent city streets. He took no cab, no subway. He walked. He moved through the city's shadowed arteries, its forgotten alleyways and parks, following paths only he could see, ancient trails of energy that lay superimposed over the concrete grid. His preparations were not of this age. In a small, anonymous apartment that smelled of dust and old paper, he shed the suit. He dressed in rough-spun trousers, a dark linen shirt, and worn leather boots that had walked on more continents than most men ever read about. The clothes were old but meticulously cared for. He did not check a computer or a map. He closed his ancient eyes and meditated, not for peace, but for sharpness. He let the city's hum fade away, replaced by the thrum of his own blood, the whisper of his own senses expanding, reaching out, tasting the air, feeling the magnetic lines of the earth beneath the city's foundation. He was an instrument tuning himself to a terrible purpose. He crossed borders as a shadow, a rumor in the corner of a tired guard's eye, a flicker on a security camera that was dismissed as a glitch. He found him in the skeletal remains of a Soviet military base, a concrete cancer decaying in the Romanian wilderness. The place stank of rust, damp, and recent slaughter. The bodies of 3 hikers, backpackers from Germany, were scattered in a clearing. They were not eaten, just broken. The work of fear, not hunger. The sleeper was in the main command bunker, a hulking shape of muscle and fur backed into the deepest, darkest corner. He was magnificent and terrifying, a creature of pure myth, his silver-pelted form heaving with panicked breaths. He was young, impossibly strong, but his eyes were pits of animal madness. There was no reason left in him, only the screaming engine of instinct. The king stepped into the bunker, not shifting from his human form. "Brother," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a plea. It was a command, a call to the mind trapped inside the beast. The only answer was a guttural snarl, a flash of 4-inch canines. The air grew thick with the promise of violence. The fight, when it came, was no grand battle. It was a tragedy performed in 2 movements. The young one lunged, a blur of claws and fury. The king moved with the economy of centuries. He did not meet force with force. He sidestepped, his hand shooting out to grip a massive forearm, redirecting the charge into a concrete wall. A sickening crunch echoed in the bunker. Before the beast could recover, the king was on him. It was an execution. Precise. Awful. A twist of the neck, a final shuddering exhalation. There was no victory in it. He looked down at the still form, at the life fading from eyes that were, for a fleeting second, lucid with a glimmer of confused recognition. He saw not an enemy, but a son, a lost, broken piece of his dying nation. He carried the body out into the woods. He built a pyre with the patient, practiced hands of a mortician who has done his work too many times. As the flames consumed the last physical evidence of his kin, turning myth back into ash and smoke, a profound weariness settled into his bones. It was a deeper cold than the mountain air. He began the long journey back to his true sanctuary, a hidden place in the Alps. Each step was an effort. He was not just a king. He was a janitor, sweeping up the dust of his own people. He was the last guardian of a graveyard that spanned the entire world, and he knew, with the chilling certainty of his immense age, that he was only delaying the inevitable. The last grave would be his own. The sleep was a river, and he had been drifting in its deepest, coldest current for an age. It was a good sleep, a sleep of power held in reserve, filled with dreams that were more real than memory. He dreamt of the great hunts under a pristine moon, the snap of frozen twigs underfoot, the hot breath of his father, the king, clouding in the air beside him. He dreamt of the vast, silent kingdom of the taiga, the scent of pine and clean snow, a world untouched by the grubby hands of the lesser race. But the river of sleep was changing. In the last few turns of the seasons, new sounds had begun to bleed into his dreams, alien and disturbing. A low, persistent hum from the world above, the angry snarl of flying things that tore the sky, and deep, shuddering jolts that shook the very bedrock of his frozen cradle. The world was having a fever dream, and he was tossing and turning with it. The final violation was water. A trickle at first, then a steady drip. The industrial clamor above, the relentless drill of a natural gas well, had fractured the integrity of his tomb. The permafrost, his ageless blanket, was compromised. Meltwater carrying the faint foul taint of machine oil seeped through a new fissure in the ice. The temperature inside his hibernation chamber ticked upward, degree by agonizing degree. It was enough. Deep within him, biological processes that had been slowed to the pace of geology sputtered back to life. The awakening was not a gentle stirring. It was a violent, convulsive agony. His blood, thick and syrupy, surged through veins that screamed in protest. Every cell in his body felt like it was being torn apart by microscopic needles, a pain like a diver surfacing too fast from the bottom of the ocean. He clawed his way out, bursting from the softened earth and rotten ice into a world that assaulted him. The sensory shock was a physical blow. The air did not smell of pine. It was a gagging cocktail of sulfur, diesel fumes, and something acrid and burnt. The sky was not a clean, endless blue. It was a pale, sickly thing, scarred with the white chalk lines of contrails. And the forest, it was gone. In its place was a landscape of violation. A wide, ugly gash of a road, a pipeline that ran like a metal scar to the horizon, and skeletal towers connected by drooping wires that hummed with a captured, angry spirit. His first sight of this new world's fauna was a monster of metal and rubber, a roaring six-wheeled truck that churned mud and belched black smoke. It thundered past his hiding place, and a surge of primal terror and fury shot through him. He almost leaped, almost threw his waking, screaming body at its flank before a deep, ancient instinct held him back. He shifted, the change from beast to man a fluid, second-nature act, and crept toward the source of the noise. It was a settlement of sorts, a cluster of prefabricated huts and trailers, a camp for the men who worked the drill. He watched from the tree line, a naked, pale figure in the gray morning light. He saw the people. They were soft, small things, bundled in strange, brightly colored synthetics. They were weak, leaning on their machines for everything. But there were so many of them. Even here, in what should have been the heart of the empty wilderness, they swarmed like ants. He found a discarded set of coveralls, the fabric stiff and smelling of sweat and chemicals. Clothed, he was just another shadow. He drifted toward the camp's communal building, a sort of mess hall and recreation room. Through a dirty window, he saw a television flickering on a wall. It was showing a hunting program. Men with high-powered rifles and triumphant grins stood over the corpses of wolves, his distant cousins. The camera lingered on the dead animals, their tongues lolling, their eyes glassy. It was presented as a sport, a trophy. A deep, cold sickness filled him. He had to find his own kind. He had to find his father. He turned his back on the human filth and began to run, following the old paths, the deep ways that only his kind knew. The journey was a litany of desecration. He found the bodies of wolves, their legs shattered by steel traps, their fur matted with dried blood. At a roadside diner, a miserable little place that stank of grease, he saw it. A taxidermied wolf, a magnificent black male, stuffed and mounted on the wall, its mouth fixed in a permanent, pathetic snarl. The sign beneath it read, The Beast of Kitlim. Shot 2018. In a tattered local newspaper he found in a trash can, an article spoke of unusually large predators plaguing livestock and the government's plan to increase the bounty. He was beginning to understand. His people were not in hiding. They were not sleeping. They were being exterminated, eradicated like vermin. He reached out with his mind, casting into the silent, empathic web that connected all of his race. He searched for the strong, reassuring presence of his father, the king. He found it, but it was not what he expected. It was a signal steeped in weariness, in sorrow, in a strange and terrible resignation. There was no anger, no call to arms, only a deep, abiding grief. He could not comprehend it. How could his father, the mightiest of them all, simply stand by and watch this happen? How could he let their people be reduced to roadside attractions and bounties? From the prince's perspective, born of a world of honor and strength, this was the ultimate betrayal. His father had not just failed them. He had surrendered. A new fire began to burn in his heart, displacing the pain of his awakening. It was the cold, clean fire of righteous fury. The sickness he felt was gone, replaced by a terrible clarity. His father was old, weak, lost in memories of a world that no longer existed. It was time for a new king. He changed his course. He was no longer seeking a reunion. He was seeking a confrontation. He crossed the continent, a phantom of vengeance moving at a speed no human could track. He swam rivers, crossed mountain ranges, a blur in the deep woods. He was going to find his father, and he was going to challenge him for the throne. The policy of patience was over. The policy of hiding was a death sentence. The only path left was war. The sanctuary was hidden behind a curtain of falling water, a place of deep-throated roaring and perpetual mist. The prince passed through the waterfall as if walking through an illusion and entered the cavern. It was his father's holiest place, a grotto carved by time and ancient purpose. The air within was still and cold, smelling of wet stone and something else, something like old sorrow. In the flickering light of a single tallow lamp, he saw the artifacts of their dying race. A great flat stone was etched with the runes of the covenant, its grooves worn smooth by the passage of centuries. Leaning against the walls were spears tipped with obsidian and axes of meteoric iron, weapons from an age when their enemies were made of flesh and magic, not steel and circuits. And everywhere, arranged on ledges with grim reverence, were the skulls of their ancestors, their hollow eyes watching the final act of their dynasty. The entire cavern was a tomb, saturated with the quiet dignity of resignation. The king sat on a simple stone throne, not turning as the prince entered. He looked ancient, a monument to decay. "I felt you coming," he said, his voice as quiet as dust settling. "Your anger is a storm I could feel from 1,000 miles away." "You felt my anger." The prince's voice was a raw, shaking thing. He strode forward, his fists clenched. "I have seen our people nailed to the walls of human taverns. I have seen their sacred lands torn open for black sludge. I have seen the filth and the weakness of this new world, and I have felt your silence." He spat the last word. "You do nothing. You hide in your cave of memories and let them pick us off one by one. You are a coward." The king finally looked up. His eyes held no fire, only a vast, bottomless pity. "I have done what I must. I am a keeper, not a warrior. The world has changed. Humanity is no longer a collection of tribes huddled around a fire. They are a global hive. Their cities are fortresses, their eyes are in the sky, and their thunder is a manufactured god that can turn forests into glass. To fight them now is not war, it is suicide. Their iron thunder would erase us from the earth. The prince laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the damp rock. Iron thunder? We are the children of the moon. We are strength and speed and fury made flesh. You speak of fear. I speak of honor. You see an ending. I see a new beginning, cleansed in the blood of our enemies. You cling to a world that is dead and gone, a covenant they broke the moment they built their first fence. He took a step closer, his own eyes burning with the fervor of a zealot. His father's wisdom was just the tired excuse of a doddering old man, afraid of his own shadow. Submission was a concept his warrior's soul could not process. "Then you are a fool?" the king said, his voice still quiet, but now edged with the hardness of granite. "No," the prince snarled, "I am the future." He drew himself up to his full height, his body thrumming with power. "I challenge you for the crown, for the right to lead our people. The old way has failed. It is time for the way of the tooth and the claw." A deep, shuddering sigh escaped the king. He rose from his throne, his old bones popping. In his eyes was a profound and terrible sadness. He had hoped it would not come to this. He knew his son's heart was a furnace of pride that could not be cooled by words. This fight was the last, most brutal lesson he had left to teach. "I accept your challenge." The transformation was explosive. In the same heartbeat, father and son shed the frail illusion of humanity. The cave, which had been a place of quiet contemplation, became an arena for titans. Two impossible creatures, all snorting fury and corded muscle, lunged at each other. The prince was a maelstrom of raw, youthful power, a battering ram of claws and fangs. He fought with the righteous rage of the wronged. The king, older and a fraction slower, fought with the brutal wisdom of 1,000 battles. He was a fencer to his son's berserker, using the cavern's tight confines, parrying, deflecting, letting the prince's own momentum work against him. The sound of their battle was the sound of bedrock cracking. They smashed against the walls, sending ancient skulls tumbling to the floor, shattering into dust. The runestone of the covenant split in two under the force of a blow. The sacred history of their people was being ground to powder under their feet. For a long time, experience held the line against ferocity. But youth is a relentless tide. In a final, desperate lunge, the prince feinted high and drove low, his speed a blur. His claws, hard as diamonds, tore through his father's side, a mortal wound. The king staggered back, a ragged groan tearing from his throat. He collapsed to his knees, his massive form shrinking, the illusion of the beast receding. As the prince stood over him, panting, his victory tasting of ash, his father looked up. The man, old and broken, returned for one last moment. Blood bubbled on his lips. He reached a trembling hand toward his son. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice a fragile rasp. "I was not protecting the world from us. I was protecting us from them. Do not break the covenant." His eyes, those ancient windows to a forgotten world, went vacant. The rage in the prince's heart guttered out, replaced by a sudden, chilling cold. The last words echoed in the sudden silence of the cave, mingling with the drip of water and the drip of his father's blood. He looked at what he had done. He had murdered his own history. He had murdered his own king. He reached down and took the crown from his father's head. It was a simple thing, a circlet of polished elk bone and dark, unadorned metal. As he placed it on his own brow, it felt impossibly heavy. In that instant, he felt the psychic web of his people settle upon him, a mantle of 1,000 sleeping souls, 1,000 grieving hearts. The triumph he had craved felt like a mouthful of funeral earth. He was the king of a graveyard. And he had just killed the only one who knew how to tend the graves. The new king did not mourn. Mourning was a luxury for a time of peace, and he had just declared war. He climbed from the sanctuary, leaving his father's body to grow cold in the desecrated cavern, and ascended to the highest, most barren peak of the Alps. The air was thin and bitingly cold, whipping at his bare skin. The world of men was a faint spattering of lights in the valleys far below, insignificant and doomed. He was about to remind them of the dark. He did not howl at the moon. A howl is a call, a claim of territory. This was something more. This was a summoning. He filled his lungs, his chest expanding to an impossible degree, and then he let it out. It was not a sound for human ears. It was a roar in the infrasonic spectrum, a pressure wave of immense power that was felt more than heard. It was a vibration that traveled not through the air, but through the solid rock beneath his feet. It was a biological key, a resonant frequency tuned to the unique physiology of his kind. It surged down into the mountain, into the tectonic plates, and spread through the crust of the planet like a ripple in a black pond. It was the ancient command of a king, a sound that said simply, "Wake." Miles deep in the Siberian taiga, in a vast communal burrow lined with the bones of mammoths, the vibration stirred the sleepers. An entire clan, 100 strong, began to shudder and twitch. Their long, slow sleep was shattered. They clawed their way to the surface, emerging into a world they did not recognize. They were disoriented, starving, their minds a fog of broken dreams. But their alpha, a scarred, grizzled giant, recognized the roar for what it was. He shook the ice from his fur, his yellow eyes blazing with purpose. He saw the pipeline, the logging roads, the scent of diesel on the wind. He tasted the air and tasted sacrilege. His first waking thought was not of food, but of vengeance. His answering howl was a promise of slaughter. In the sweltering green hell of the Amazon basin, hidden within the vine-choked ruins of a forgotten Inca city, another kind of sleeper awoke. This clan was sleeker, faster. Their pelts dappled like the jaguar. They had slept through the rise and fall of empires, but they awoke to the sound of chainsaws and the sight of their world burning. The sacred forest was being devoured by fire and machines. The king's roar for them was not just a command. It was an affirmation of their deepest, most violent fears. Their rage was the protective fury of a mother whose nest is being destroyed. Across the world, the awakening rippled. In the vast, lonely national parks of northern Canada, solitary hunters and small family packs emerged from caves and deep woods dens. They stumbled into campgrounds and logging operations. The first encounters were not battles, they were massacres. Confused tourists and startled lumberjacks were met with a bewildered, panicked violence that left no survivors. The news reported them as freak bear attacks, an anomaly. The network came alive. From the Rocky Mountains to the misty highlands of Scotland, from the deep forests of India to the fjords of Norway, the sleepers rose, thousands of them, a hidden nation, a secret army shaking off the dust of centuries. They were a tide of primal power, and the new king felt every single one of them. He stood on his mountain peak, the wind a gale around him, and felt their collective consciousness flood into his own. He felt their hunger, their confusion, their rage, and above all, their unquestioning loyalty to the command that had woken them. He was no longer just a prince who had killed his father. He was the general of a vast and terrible army, an army of nightmares made real. He felt their questions, their pleas for guidance in this strange new world, and he gave them their first orders. Using the same empathic bond that had carried his roar, he sent out a simple, brutal command that echoed in the mind of every one of his subjects. Attack. Hunt the man-things. Tear down their noisy machines, burn their wooden nests, rip apart their metal caravans. Remind them of the old laws. Remind them what it means to fear the night. He offered no complex strategy, no grand design. He was not a politician. He was a force of nature. He was unchaining chaos and loosing it upon the world that had stolen his birthright. For a few days, the world noticed nothing. A strange incident at a Russian radar station. A series of gruesome attacks on a remote stretch of the Trans-Canada Highway. An unexplained explosion at a Brazilian oil facility. The events were too scattered, too bizarre to be connected by the rational minds of men. They were blips on a screen, footnotes in the global news cycle. But in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of intelligence agencies and military think tanks, the analysts were already frowning. They were plotting the incidents on a map, and a pattern, terrifying and impossible, was beginning to emerge. The storm was gathering. The world was holding its breath, and it did not even know why. The coordinated assault began on a moonless night. It was not a rampage. It was a campaign. It was war. Executed with a horrifying blend of animal cunning and intelligent design. In the remote forests of the Russian Federation, the Siberian clan, moving as a single silent wave, descended on a military town that served a critical early warning radar installation. They did not attack the hardened bunkers. They severed the power lines, tore through the residential barracks, and vanished back into the taiga before a proper response could be mounted. The radar went dark. Far across the globe, on a lonely stretch of highway in the Canadian Rockies, a trucker named Dave was halfway through a triple-shot espresso and a stale donut, listening to a late-night call-in show about alien abductions. He laughed, thinking how crazy people were. Then his world dissolved into a nightmare. Something impossibly large and fast slammed into the side of his cab, peeling the door off like a tin can lid. He saw a flash of yellow eyes, a cavernous mouth, and then only a searing, final pain. For 200 miles, the Trans-Canada Highway fell silent as packs of lithe, gray killers methodically disabled every truck, every car, creating a chain of burning wreckage. The fire that dawned was literal. In Brazil, the jaguar-like clan swarmed an inland oil processing facility. They ignored the guards, their claws finding purchase on the metal latticework of the refining towers. They tore open pipes and feeder lines with the ease of a bear opening a rotten log. The ensuing explosion was seen for 100 miles, a man-made sun that briefly lit up the violated rainforest. For the people on the ground, it was the end of the world. A soldier on sentry duty in Russia staring into the woods saw not a man, not an animal, but a dozen pairs of eyes that moved with the terrifying discipline of a special forces unit. A family in their idyllic log cabin in Montana heard a scratching at the door, dismissed it as a raccoon, and then watched in screaming disbelief as the reinforced oak door was ripped from its hinges. The creatures that poured in were not wolves. They were smarter. They were faster. The horror was absolute, unscripted, and final. The media landscape exploded. Panic, fueled by grainy cell phone footage and wild speculation, became a pandemic. The first military responses were a catastrophic failure. Squads of elite soldiers, men trained to fight insurgents in desert cities, were sent into the deep woods. They went in with night vision and automatic weapons, confident and professional. They did not come out. Their last radio transmissions were a garble of screams, gunfire, and a sound that no one could identify. Attack helicopters scrambled to provide air support found nothing. The enemy moved under the thick canopy, using caves and gullies, vanishing as if the forest itself had swallowed them. By day, the woods were empty. By night, they were a killing ground. The prince, the new king, led an assault himself. He chose a major North Atlantic Treaty Organization air base in the desolate highlands of eastern Turkey. He was not a general directing from the rear. He was the tip of the spear. He was a whirlwind of destruction, a being of impossible strength and speed who moved through concertina wire and sandbagged emplacements as if they were mist. He tore the gun from a heavy machine gun nest with his bare hands and used it as a club. He watched the soldiers, these proud, disciplined men, break and run in raw animal panic. He saw their terror, and it was a balm to his wounded soul. This easy, intoxicating victory was proof. He was right. His father was wrong. This was how their world would be reborn. The world's leaders could no longer afford disbelief. At an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, the evidence was laid bare. Satellite photos of the dead Russian radar station. Thermal imaging from a drone over Canada showing large, warm-blooded shapes moving at 50 miles an hour. The testimony of a single shell-shocked survivor from the Turkish base. A man who could only babble about devils made of shadow and teeth. The conclusion was insane but inescapable. Humanity was not at the top of the food chain. They were at war with a species they did not know existed, a species that was intelligent, hostile, and winning. Global martial law was declared. Borders slammed shut. A curfew was imposed on all rural and forested areas across the Northern Hemisphere. Mobilization orders went out. In secret bunkers and military academies, analysts worked around the clock, poring over the scant data, trying to build a profile of the enemy, trying to understand the new rules of engagement. And on a mountaintop in Turkey, surrounded by the howling triumph of his warriors, the king tasted victory. His armies had struck a paralyzing blow, sowing chaos and fear across the globe. They had reclaimed vast territories of the night. He believed in that moment of pure, unadulterated success that the war was almost over. He was drunk on power and righteous fury. He could not see the gears of the great human machine beginning to turn. The first shock had passed. Now the largest, most ruthlessly efficient predator the world had ever known was recovering its balance, shaking its head to clear the ringing, and slowly, deliberately taking aim. Deep beneath the rolling hills of Virginia, in a sterile, windowless bunker that hummed with the quiet power of 1,000 servers, the International Task Force was born. They called it Lycan Zero. It was not just soldiers. It was a coalition of the best and the brightest, and the most ruthless. military strategists who had planned invasions, evolutionary biologists who specialized in apex predators, cryptographers, anthropologists, and even a handful of disgraced cryptozoologists who were dragged out of obscurity and suddenly found themselves with the highest security clearances in the world. They worked under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, fueled by coffee and a cold professional dread. They analyzed every frame of footage, every garbled audio file, every plaster cast of a footprint. The first breakthrough came from above. The old spy satellites designed to count missile silos were retasked. New birds with powerful thermal imaging capabilities were rushed into orbit. They began to see. They could not see individual figures under the trees, but they could see heat blooms. Large concentrations of warm-blooded life where no town or city should be. The picture was clarified by high-altitude drones. The tireless, all-seeing eyes of modern warfare began a 24/7 vigil over the world's hotspots. They flew at 60,000 feet, silent and invisible, their cameras turning the wilderness into a detailed, color-coded map of enemy positions. The man in charge of Lycan Zero's military arm was a United States Army general named Stanton, a man with a chest full of medals and eyes that had seen too much in the sand pits of Iraq and Afghanistan. He watched the footage of his elite troops being torn apart in the woods and came to a simple, brutal conclusion. "We don't fight them in the forest," he announced to the grim-faced command staff. "That's their turf. We take the forest away from them." The strategy shifted overnight. Direct engagement was forbidden. This would not be a war of rifles and patrols. It would be a war of remote, overwhelming force. The first test of the new doctrine came in Siberia. A spy satellite identified the heat signature of the main Siberian clan, bivouacked in a vast swathe of old-growth taiga. Within hours, a squadron of Russian attack jets was scrambled. They did not drop conventional bombs. They dropped incendiary clusters. The forest, dry from an early autumn, erupted into a hellscape. A wall of fire, miles wide, swept through the trees. The wolves, who had never known an enemy they could not see or smell, were caught in a trap of pure heat and smoke. They had no defense against an enemy that killed with weather. Their howls of defiance turned into shrieks of agony as they were cooked alive in their ancestral home. The technological slaughter had begun. In Canada, American and Russian attack helicopters, flying in newly formed joint task forces, began hunting at night. Through their advanced thermal sights, the creatures were not fearsome shadows. They were glowing white silhouettes against a cool, dark background. They were targets. The heavy chain guns firing high explosive rounds tore through muscle and bone with mechanical indifference. In the Rocky Mountains, batteries of multiple launch rocket systems were given coordinates gathered by drones. They did not aim for the enemy. They aimed for the entire grid square. The forest was pulverized. Whole hillsides flayed to bare rock and splintered wood. For the soldiers on the ground, the fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, grim efficiency. They were issued new weapons: heavy machine guns, automatic grenade launchers, ammunition designed for anti-material work. They were no longer the hunted. They were the exterminators. The psychological tide of the war had turned. The monsters were terrifying, yes, but they could be killed. They could be burned. They could be blown to pieces from 5 miles away. The primal fear was replaced by the familiar, comforting calculus of modern warfare. News of the catastrophic losses began to trickle back to the king. Through the empathic web, he felt the searing agony of the Siberian clan as they burned. He felt the blind panic of the packs in the Rockies as the sky fell on them. It did not make sense. His warriors were dying without ever seeing a human face, without ever sinking their claws into flesh. How could they fight an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere at once? The elation of his first victories curdled into a knot of cold dread in his stomach. His father's words about iron thunder echoed in his mind, no longer sounding like the ramblings of an old man, but like a prophecy he had been too arrogant to hear. He realized he was losing. The war of attrition he had started was a war he could not win. They had the numbers, the machines, the endless fire. He needed a decisive blow. He needed to strike at the heart of their power, to blind their all-seeing eyes and silence their thunder. He had to risk everything on one final desperate gamble. The mobile lab was a city of sterile white tents and humming generators, airlifted onto the scorched earth where the Siberian clan had made their last stand. It was a self-contained world of stainless steel and reinforced glass, dropped into the middle of a charcoal forest. Here, under the command of a brilliant and profoundly cynical biologist named Dr. Ava Chen, the first intact specimens were brought in. Dr. Chen, a specialist in extremophilic organisms, looked at the massive furred corpses being forklifted onto her examination tables, not with horror or wonder, but with the voracious curiosity of a watchmaker presented with a completely new kind of clock. The autopsies were a revelation. The creature's physiology was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. The muscle fibers were interwoven with a collagen-like polymer, giving them a tensile strength 10 times that of a human's. The bones were not simple calcium. They were a composite, honeycombed for lightness, but reinforced with metallic trace elements, making them incredibly difficult to break. They found 2 hearts, a smaller, steady one for the human form, and a massive, high-capacity pump that kicked in during transformation, flooding the body with super-oxygenated blood. It was a biological war machine. The puzzle of the transformation itself was unlocked by a team of geneticists. They discovered a unique type of pluripotent stem cell, dormant in the bone marrow. On receiving a specific neurochemical signal, a surge of adrenaline and tailored pheromones, these cells would activate, acting like a biological factory. They did not just change shape. They broke down and rebuilt the body's entire structure on a cellular level, following a genetic blueprint that had lain dormant. The process was fantastically energy-intensive, explaining the creature's ravenous metabolism and the constant gnawing hunger that drove them. But the sequencing of their full genetic map delivered the greatest shock of all. This was not an alien species. It was not a different branch of evolution. It was a variation of Homo sapiens. The genetic markers were unmistakable. The difference was a single, impossibly complex retrovirus that had integrated itself into their ancestors' genetic code thousands of years ago. A latent gene, a piece of viral code that rewrote the rules of biology. They were not monsters. They were cousins, a lost, divergent tribe of humanity. This knowledge brought with it the key to their destruction. Science, in its cold and impartial way, found their weaknesses. The same hyper-efficient regenerative process, fueled by that rapid cell division, was their Achilles heel. Dr. Chen's team discovered that certain heavy metals, silver, tungsten, mercury acted as a catastrophic catalyst poison. They did not just wound. They bonded with the key enzymes that governed the cellular reconstruction, halting the process dead. The regeneration did not just stop. It went into a state of cascading cellular failure. The old myths had a basis in biochemistry. The discovery was immediately relayed to military research and development. Within weeks, factories were churning out bullets with tungsten-silver alloy cores. The truth, however, was too big to contain. A junior technician in the genetics lab, horrified by the implications of what he was seeing, leaked the core findings onto the internet. The report, Preliminary Analysis of Non-Human Combatant Genome, went viral. The world's public, already reeling from the war, fractured. The revelation that the enemy was, in a biological sense, human, created a firestorm of ethical and religious debate. Protesters gathered with signs that read, "They are people too," while others screamed for the complete annihilation of the mutant plague. The war was no longer just about survival. It was now about the very definition of humanity. Dr. Chen was indifferent to the debate. For her, this was not about ethics, it was about opportunity. She saw the creature's genetic map as the ultimate biological toolkit. In their programmable stem cells and their flawless regeneration, she saw the cure for cancer, for aging, for every human frailty. She saw the potential to build a better human, a super soldier. She lobbied military command relentlessly, not just for more samples, but for live subjects. The war, for her, was not a tragedy. It was a once-in-a-species chance to seize the secrets of a rival creation, to steal fire from a different set of gods. Her ambition went far beyond winning a war. She wanted to hijack an entire evolutionary path for her own purposes. The king knew the war of shadows was lost. His packs were being hunted from the sky, incinerated by an enemy they could not reach. Desperation forged a new plan, a single, all-or-nothing gambit. He would gather every warrior he had left, a ragged but still formidable army drawn from the survivors of a dozen shattered clans, and throw them at the brain of the machine. Their target: Isen Air Force Base in the Alaskan interior. It was more than an air base. It was the primary command and control hub for the entire Arctic theater, the nerve center that directed the drones and satellites that were slaughtering his people. If he could blind the enemy, even for a short time, he might regain the initiative. He might give his people a chance to scatter and hide, to live to fight another day. But the enemy was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. General Stanton and the Lycan Zero analysts, reading the patterns of the werewolves' movements, saw the attack coming. The consolidation of the scattered packs into one massive force could only mean one thing. Stanton did not try to intercept them in the wilderness. He did the opposite. He turned Isen into a Venus flytrap. He reinforced the perimeter, dug in heavy armored vehicles and armored fighting vehicles, and flew in battalions of battle-hardened Marines. He lined the open ground with claymore mines, and laid fields of concertina wire laced with chemical lights. He was not defending a base. He was setting a killbox. The assault came under the faint, ethereal glow of the aurora borealis, a silent, flowing river of green light in the polar sky. Thousands of dark shapes surged out of the frozen woods, a living tide of claws and fury. They moved with terrifying speed and silence across the snow. The first wave hit the outer perimeter like a sledgehammer, tearing through the wire and overwhelming the forward listening posts in seconds. The king was at the forefront, a black-furred demon of immense size, his presence a beacon of rage that drove his warriors onward. They poured onto the open ground before the main base, the prepared killing field. And then Stanton sprang his trap. 100 high-intensity floodlights blazed to life, turning the polar night into a shadowless artificial day. The sudden, brilliant light was disorienting, blinding. In the same instant, the world erupted in a symphony of orchestrated destruction. The heavy machine guns opened up, their slugs, now tipped with the new silver tungsten alloy, tearing through the charging ranks. The effect was horrifying. Creatures that could once shrug off rifle fire were now punched off their feet, their bodies refusing to heal, the wounds smoking as the alloy did its work. The king, for the first time in his life, felt the true, soul-crushing power of his father's iron thunder. He saw one of his mightiest alphas, a beast that could wrestle a grizzly bear to a standstill, simply vanish in the pink mist of a direct hit from a heavy armored vehicle's main cannon. He saw the sky rain fire as drones dropped cluster munitions that blossomed into hundreds of smaller explosions, scything through his warriors like a harvester through wheat. Automated sentry turrets, guided by thermal optics, tracked and fired with inhuman precision, missing nothing. The primal rage of his army shattered against a wall of cold industrial mathematics. Their courage, their strength, it all meant nothing here. In a final act of desperate, suicidal fury, the king himself broke through the storm of fire and steel and reached the main defensive line. He launched himself at the nearest heavy armored vehicle, a 70-ton behemoth of steel and depleted uranium. He landed on its turret, his claws, which could shred concrete, screaming as they scraped uselessly against the composite armor. He roared, a sound of pure, heartbroken rage, and stared into the dark slit of the vehicle's primary sight. In that moment, looking at the unblinking mechanical eye of his enemy, he understood. This was not a war between warriors. It was a confrontation between a myth and a machine, and the machine was winning. A proximity-fused artillery shell detonated 50 feet above him, showering the armored vehicle with white-hot shrapnel. He was thrown from the turret, his body riddled with metal shards. He lay in the blood-soaked snow, his regeneration struggling against the sheer scale of the damage. He looked around and saw the ruin of his army. The charge had broken. The survivors were being methodically hunted down and exterminated. His great and terrible gambit had failed. His people were being annihilated. Through the empathic web, a thread of agony and despair, he gave his last command as a king. Flee, scatter, survive. Dragging his broken body, he gathered a handful of his remaining guard and melted back into the frozen darkness, leaving the cacophony of the slaughterhouse behind him. The battle was over. The war was lost. The world celebrated. News channels ran the footage from Isen on a loop. The stark, bleached-out images from the floodlights, the dark shapes of the monsters falling before a tide of tracer fire. It was a victory for humanity, a moment of collective relief and savage triumph. But the cost was written in the ledgers of 100 nations, thousands of dead soldiers and civilians, billions in damages, entire ecosystems incinerated, and a deep primal fear that now lodged itself permanently in the human psyche. The victory on the frozen plains of Alaska was not the end. It was the beginning of the end. With the enemy's main force shattered, the governments of the world initiated the final phase of the operation. It was officially called the Global Pacification Initiative. The soldiers on the ground called it the Great Cleansing. Bounties were issued, not just for military units, but for private military contractors, for survivalists, for any hunter with a powerful rifle and a stomach for the work. The forests and mountains of the world, once places of recreation and natural beauty, became free fire zones. The war devolved into a series of brutal, tragic postscripts. In a cave deep in the Appalachian Mountains, a mated pair who had stayed out of the Prince's War tried to hide with their newborn pup. They were found by a private military contractor squad using a portable thermal imager that detected their body heat through 6 feet of rock. The squad did not risk going in. They sealed the entrance and pushed the nozzle of a military-grade flamethrower through a fissure. The family's last moments were a frantic, screeching inferno. In the Scottish Highlands, an ancient, solitary wolf, one who remembered the king's father, one who had chosen sleep over war, was hunted for 3 weeks by a team of trophy-seeking millionaires in a helicopter. They did not kill him quickly. They chased him to exhaustion, darting him with trackers, herding him into the open. The final kill was filmed in high definition. The old wolf's magnificent silver pelt a prize to be hung on a billionaire's wall. The shattered remnants of the king's army turned on each other. Some, seeing the utter futility of the fight, tried to follow their old instincts, to find deep, hidden places, and force themselves back into the long sleep. But the world was too loud now, too full of human noise and vibration. Others, driven mad by loss and rage, became little more than terrorists. They launched suicide attacks on civilian targets. A shopping mall in Germany, a train station in Japan, acts of pure nihilistic despair that only hardened humanity's resolve to see them all wiped from the face of the earth. And the king, now a prince of nothing, an exile in his own world, watched it all. He hid, he ran, he survived, but he was tethered to the pain of his people. The empathic web had become an instrument of torture. He felt the fire in the Appalachians. He felt the cold shock of the tranquilizer dart in Scotland. He felt every bullet, every trap, every last gasping breath as the lights of his people went out, one by one across the globe. The guilt was a physical thing, a crushing weight that bowed his back and hollowed his eyes. He had wanted to be their savior. Instead, he had become their executioner. His glorious war, his righteous crusade, had led them directly to the abattoir. The debate in human society raged on, a footnote to the slaughter. Scientists like Dr. Chen argued for the capture of live specimens for study. Humanitarian groups, now branded as monster sympathizers, held vigils and protests that were drowned out by the chorus of fear and retribution. But the military and political leaders had made their decision. The risk of another war, however small, was unacceptable. The order was simple: extermination. No exceptions, no survivors. By the end of the year, it was over. The great, wild army that had shaken the foundations of the world was gone. All that remained were whispers and phantoms. A few dozen perhaps scattered across the harshest and most remote corners of the planet, hunted, starving, and utterly alone. The king's rebellion had ended not with a bang, but with the whimpering, lonely death of a species. The war was over, but peace did not return. The world had been shown a monster in its closet, and even with the monster gone, no one could sleep soundly again. A new global order was forged in the fires of the conflict. The Charter of the United Nations was rewritten. A new entity, the Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency, was created. It was an organization with no precedent, a fusion of the World Health Organization, the International Criminal Police Organization, and a Global Special Forces Command. The Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency had its own army, its own intelligence network, and most terrifyingly, a mandate that allowed it to operate on any nation's soil without permission if a credible anomalous biological threat was detected. It was the planet's immune system, and it answered to no one. The scientific fallout was a new gold rush. The trickle of data from Dr. Chen's early work became a flood as Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency laboratories around the world began dissecting the thousands of corpses recovered from the Great Cleansing. The secrets of the werewolf genetic map were laid bare. A revolution in medicine and military technology began. Corporations and governments raced to patent gene therapies derived from their regenerative abilities. The first successful trials saw lab rats regrowing severed limbs. The military applications were even more profound. Experimental muscle grafts, optical nerve enhancements, adrenal stimulants. The dream of the super soldier was becoming a terrifying reality. Dr. Chen, now lauded as the savior of humanity and the mother of a new age of biology, was given a blank check to head the Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency's entire research and development division. Culture buckled under the strain. The confirmation that myth was real, and then the subsequent systematic annihilation of that reality, sent a fissure through the human psyche. Religion struggled to incorporate the existence of a divergent human species created by a viral act. New cults sprang up overnight, some worshipping the wolves as martyred nature gods, others demanding genetic purges to hunt down any humans who might be latent carriers of the ancient retrovirus. Conspiracy theories, once the domain of the fringe, became mainstream. If werewolves were real, what else were the governments hiding? Bigfoot? The thing in Loch Ness? The paranoia was a low-grade fever that infected everyone. History was rewritten. Archaeologists and historians, looking back with new eyes, began finding evidence that had been there all along. Strange references in Viking sagas. Anatomical anomalies in bones recovered from Neolithic burial sites. Mistranslated passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A new hidden history of the world began to emerge. A history of two human races sharing a planet, one in the light, one in the shadows. For the prince, this new world was a personal hell. Hiding in the ruins of a forgotten industrial district in Eastern Europe, he used a stolen laptop and a pirated satellite link to watch the world gloat over his people's corpses. He saw a news report about a black market auction where the pelt of his greatest warrior, the Alpha from the Siberian clan, sold for $15 million to an anonymous collector. And then he saw the worst thing of all. A slick online catalog for a private collection of mythological artifacts owned by a reclusive tech billionaire. And there it was. The skull of his father, polished and mounted on a marble plinth, its description clinically noting the unique cranial structure and evidence of death by penetrating claw trauma. The sight of it broke something deep inside him. The grief, the guilt, the sorrow. It all burned away. leaving behind something cold, hard, and eternal. It was pure distilled hatred. His race would not be a footnote in a history book or a trophy on a rich man's shelf. Meanwhile, in a black site anomaly control and biocontainment agency laboratory deep beneath the Utah salt flats, Dr. Chen initiated her pet project. She no longer had to lobby for it. She now commanded it. The official designation was Project Prometheus. The goal was no longer to just borrow from the werewolf genetic map, but to merge it. To activate the latent retrovirus within a human subject under controlled conditions. To create not a super soldier, but a new species, a controllable monster. The first human trials were volunteers from death row. The results were not controllable. They were abominations, unstable, screaming things that possessed the strength of the beast, but none of the intelligence of the man, creatures of pure, agonizing instinct that had to be terminated with flamethrowers in their sterile containment cells. But Chen was not deterred. She had the biological material of an entire species to work with. She would get it right. The hate was a compass. It gave him direction when all other paths had turned to ash. He had to disappear. He had to go to a place so barren, so empty of life and memory, that no human would ever think to look for him. A place where the satellites saw nothing but white, and the ground was too cold to hold a heat signature. He looked at a faded world map in a derelict library, and his eyes fell upon it. Greenland. A continent of ice, a frozen desert at the top of the world. It was a perfect tomb. The journey was an exercise in erasure. He became a phantom, a stowaway in the dark bellies of rust-bucket cargo ships, a shadow that slipped across borders in the dead of night. He crossed the Atlantic in a container filled with machine parts, the air thick with the smell of grease and brine. He fed on fish he caught from the sea with his bare hands, their cold, wriggling life a small, sad echo of the hunts of his youth. The endless gray ocean was a purgatory, a space for him to think. And in the lonely darkness, his father's last words came back to him again and again. I was protecting us. From them. He finally understood. It was not a metaphor. His father, the old king, had seen this coming. He had not seen the drones or the satellites, but he had understood the trajectory. He knew that the human world, the world of invention and industry and relentless expansion, was fundamentally incompatible with his own. Their magic was nature, instinct, and blood. The human magic was fire, steel, and the splitting of the atom. There was no room for both. The king had not been a coward cowering in a cave. He had been a wise and tragic zookeeper, desperately trying to keep his unique, endangered species from wandering into the path of an oncoming freight train. The understanding brought no peace. It only sharpened the edges of his guilt until it was a blade in his gut. His pride, his warrior's honor, his refusal to listen. He had seen his father's wisdom as weakness, and in his arrogance he had grabbed the controls of the train and aimed it directly at his own people. He was not a fallen hero. He was the fool who had led his entire race to the slaughterhouse. He reached the coast of Greenland, a desolate shore of black rock and grinding ice. He slipped away from the port town and walked north into the vast white emptiness of the ice cap. The cold was a clean, purifying thing. It burned the scent of humanity from his lungs. Here there was only the wind and the ice and the sky. It was a world stripped down to its essentials, a landscape that mirrored the emptiness inside him. He found what he was looking for, a network of glacial caves, tunnels carved into the heart of the ice by subsurface meltwater. The walls glowed with a faint, blue, ancient light. This would be his sanctuary, his prison. Here, in the absolute silence, he felt the last threads of the empathic web snap. For months, he had felt the lights of his kin winking out across the globe. A sudden flare of terror in the Congo, then nothing. A flicker of defiant rage in the Australian outback, then silence. Now the web itself was gone. The silence in his mind was no longer the absence of noise, but the presence of a profound and total void. He reached out and felt nothing. He was the last one, the last king, the last wolf, the sole survivor of a planetary extinction event he himself had caused, a living fossil. The memories came then, not of the war, not of the blood and the fire. He remembered his childhood. He remembered the weight of his father's hand in human form on his shoulder. He remembered the stories his mother told, legends of the first wolves who had walked with the stars. He remembered the smell of his mother's fur. He wept, for the first time since he had taken the crown. He did not weep for his lost army or his shattered kingdom. He wept for the smell of home. The tears froze on his cheeks. And as the grief washed through him, leaving him scoured and empty, something new began to form in the void. A purpose. It was not born of hope or rage, but of cold, hard logic. He could not win. He could not rebuild. He could not avenge. But he could endure. And he could make sure that what humanity had destroyed, they would never be allowed to forget. He made his choice in the blue-lit silence of his ice cave. If he could not rule as a king, he would reign as a terror. If he could not be a savior, he would be a specter. He would strip away the man, the prince, the failed general, and become a pure elemental force. He would become the thing that scratches at the door in the middle of a blizzard. He would be the shadow that flits at the edge of the headlights on a lonely road. He would not let his people be a specimen in a jar or a footnote in a history book. He would make them a legend again, a story told in a hushed voice around a fire, a reason for men to fear the dark. He would become the myth. For years, the world moved on. The Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency became a permanent, powerful fixture of global politics. Dr. Chen's project Prometheus, after many horrific failures, began to yield stable, if terrifying, results. The war became a memory, a strange, violent chapter in a history textbook. The fear faded into a dull, background hum. People began to venture back into the woods. Then came the first incident. A state-of-the-art climate research station in the Greenland interior, one of the most remote and secure facilities on the planet, went silent. An Anomaly Control and Biocontainment Agency rapid response team was dispatched. They found the station utterly demolished. Multi-million-dollar scientific equipment was twisted into scrap metal. Reinforced structures were torn open as if by a giant can opener. The personnel, 23 scientists and technicians, were gone, vanished. There were no bodies, no blood, no signs of a struggle. There was only one piece of evidence, preserved perfectly in the wind-scoured snow that was already beginning to drift over the wreckage. A single, impossibly large paw print. The story was officially buried under a mountain of military-grade secrecy. The official report cited a catastrophic structural failure due to unseasonably extreme weather. But whispers leaked out. A traumatized anomaly control and biocontainment agency soldier told a story to his brother, who told a friend at a bar. The story of the empty station and the single monstrous track. The internet, ever hungry for conspiracies, latched onto it. They called him the survivor, the last wolf. Years later, the man, no longer a prince but not just a man, stood on a craggy tor in the Scottish Highlands. He looked older now, his human face weathered by more than just time, his eyes holding the ancient cold of the Greenland ice. Far below, in the warm, inviting light of a village pub, a group of hikers were gathered around the peat fire. He did not need his enhanced hearing to know what they were talking about. Their frightened, excited tones carried on the wind. They were telling a story. A new story, a local story, about a spectral great beast, a phantom wolf the size of a pony that was said to haunt these hills, a creature that never killed, but was sometimes seen watching from the misty peaks. A warning. He listened to the sound of his own legend being born. He was alone. He was the last of his kind, a king with no subjects, a specter haunting a world that had murdered his family. He had lost everything. But as he heard the fear and awe in their voices, a bitter, terrible and triumphant smile touched his lips for the first time in an age.